A barefoot boy with nothing but torn clothes slipped through the iron gates of a French billionaire's estate. Inside, he found a girl trapped in silence and sorrow. What he did next, without asking for anything in return, would shatter the walls of pride and change 3 lives forever. This is the story of how one act of kindness became a miracle. If you love stories that restore your faith in humanity, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you never miss a tale that touches the heart. Now let's begin. In the hills overlooking Lyon, France, there stood a mansion so grand that tourists would stop their cars just to take photographs through the iron gates. The estate belonged to Laurent Beaumont, a name whispered in boardrooms across Europe with equal parts admiration and envy. Oil refineries in the North Sea, luxury hotels in Paris, shipping lanes that stretched from Marseille to Monaco. Laurent didn't just have money. He had empire-building power, the kind that turned struggling industries into gold mines overnight. But behind those towering gates, beyond the marble fountains and manicured gardens, lived a man whose greatest fortune had slipped through his fingers like sand. His daughter, Celeste, sat in her wheelchair by the window of the East Garden every afternoon. She was only 8 years old, with soft brown curls and eyes that once sparkled with mischief. She used to race through those very gardens, chasing butterflies and laughing so loudly that even the gardeners would smile. But that was before the accident. Before the rainy December night when a truck skidded across the highway and collided with their car. Before her mother, Isabelle, was killed instantly. Before Celeste's legs stopped moving. The doctors had been polite but firm. The damage to her spine is severe, Monsieur Beaumont. We've done everything we can. But Laurent refused to accept it. He flew Celeste to Switzerland for experimental surgery. To London for therapy with the best specialists money could buy. To Tokyo for treatments that sounded more like science fiction than medicine. Every flight ended the same way, Celeste returning home quieter, smaller, more distant. And slowly, something worse than paralysis took hold. Celeste stopped speaking unless spoken to. She stopped asking questions. She stopped crying. She just existed. A little girl trapped not only in her wheelchair, but in a silence so heavy it pressed down on the entire mansion like fog. Laurent tried everything. He hired musicians to play for her. He brought in puppies, kittens, even a magician from Marseille who could make doves appear from thin air. Nothing. Celeste would glance up briefly, offer a polite nod, then return her gaze to the window, as if searching for something far away that no one else could see. The mansion became a tomb. The hallways echoed with emptiness. The chandeliers sparkled, but there was no warmth. Laurent would sit in his study late at night, staring at photographs of Isabelle holding baby Celeste, and wonder if he'd lost them both that December night. It was a warm July afternoon when everything changed. Celeste sat in her usual spot in the garden, her blanket draped over her knees, her hands resting lifelessly on the armrests of her wheelchair. The sky was a brilliant blue. Somewhere beyond the gates, the city hummed with life, cars honking, people laughing, the world spinning forward. But inside the Beaumont estate, time had stopped. Then, through a gap in the ivy-covered iron fence, a boy slipped inside. His name was Nico, though most people on the streets just called him the dancer, or that kid. He was maybe 10 years old, though it was hard to tell. His jeans were torn at the knees, his t-shirt faded and too big for his bony shoulders. His feet were bare, calloused from walking on hot pavement and cold cobblestones. His dark hair stuck up in wild directions, and his face was smudged with dirt. But his eyes were alive. Nico had been wandering the wealthy neighborhoods that day, not to steal, but just to see. To imagine. To dream about what it might feel like to live behind those gates, to sleep in a bed, to eat 3 meals without wondering where the next one would come from. He'd been living on the streets of Lyon for 2 years now, ever since the shelter told him he was too old to stay. Most nights, he slept under the Pont Lafayette Bridge with other forgotten children. Some days, he danced at traffic lights, hoping drivers would toss him a few coins. Other days, he danced just to keep himself from disappearing. But today, as he peeked through the fence, he saw her. A little girl. Alone. Sitting so still she looked like a statue. And on her face, sadness. The kind of sadness Nico recognized instantly because he'd worn it himself 1,000 times. Something shifted in his chest. Without thinking, without planning, Nico squeezed through the gap in the fence and stepped into the garden. His bare feet touched the soft grass, and for a moment he just stood there unsure. Then he remembered what always worked when the world felt too heavy. He began to dance. Not a rehearsed dance. Not something he'd learned from a video or a teacher. Just pure, ridiculous, exaggerated movement. He flailed his arms like a windmill. He hopped on one foot, then the other. He spun in a circle, stumbled dramatically, caught himself with wide eyes, and froze like a cartoon character who'd just realized he'd made a mistake. Celeste blinked. Nico wiggled his eyebrows and crossed his eyes. He puffed out his cheeks and waddled like a penguin across the lawn. And then she giggled. It was small at first. Just a tiny sound, like a bird chirping after a long winter. But it was there. Nico's heart soared. He spun faster, fell to the ground, rolled like a log, popped back up, and bowed deeply like a knight greeting a queen. Celeste clapped her hands. And then she laughed. Not a polite laugh. Not a forced smile. A real, full-bodied, uncontrollable laugh that echoed across the garden and shattered the silence that had ruled the Beaumont estate for months. Inside the mansion, Laurent Beaumont froze mid-step. He was walking past the grand window overlooking the garden when he heard it, a sound he thought he'd never hear again. His daughter's laughter. His heart stopped. Then it slammed in his chest like a drum. He rushed to the balcony, his hands gripping the stone railing, his eyes scanning the garden below. And there, on his pristine lawn, was a barefoot street boy spinning like a madman while his daughter, his silent, broken daughter, laughed until tears streamed down her cheeks. Laurent's first instinct was rage. Who is this boy? How did he get in? Where are the guards? But before he could shout, before he could call security, he saw Celeste's face. Her cheeks were flushed. Her eyes were bright. Her hands were moving, clapping, reaching alive. And Laurent Beaumont, one of the wealthiest men in France, realized something that made his knees weak. This ragged, nameless boy had done in 5 minutes what all his money couldn't do in 5 months. He'd brought his daughter back to life. Laurent didn't move from his spot on the balcony. His hands gripped the railing so tightly his knuckles turned white. Below, the boy continued his wild performance, spinning, leaping, pretending to trip over invisible objects. And Celeste? She was radiant. Her laughter rang out like church bells on a Sunday morning, clear and pure and full of life. Laurent's mind raced. Part of him wanted to storm down there and demand answers. Who is this child? What does he want? But another part of him, the part that had been suffocating under grief for months, whispered something different. Don't ruin this. Not yet. So he stayed hidden, watching through the afternoon light as his daughter clapped and cheered, as the boy performed with the energy of someone who had nothing to lose and everything to give. When the sun began to dip toward the horizon, the boy finally stopped. He was panting, sweating, grinning from ear to ear. Celeste wiped tears from her eyes, still giggling softly. Will you come back tomorrow? She asked, her voice small but hopeful. The boy hesitated. Then he nodded. If you want me to. I do, Celeste said firmly. Please. The boy smiled, gave one last exaggerated bow, and slipped back through the gap in the fence. Just like that, he was gone. Laurent stood frozen for a long moment. Then he turned and walked slowly back inside, his heart still pounding. The next afternoon, Laurent made sure he was in the garden when the boy arrived. He sat on a stone bench partially hidden by rose bushes, pretending to read a newspaper. But his eyes were locked on the gate. At exactly 4 o'clock, the boy slipped through. This time, Celeste was waiting, her face bright with anticipation. You came, she said, clapping her hands. Of course, the boy said with a grin. A promise is a promise. He launched into another performance, this time pretending to be a mime trapped in an invisible box, pressing his hands against invisible walls, his face twisted in exaggerated panic. Celeste doubled over with laughter. Laurent watched in silence. He noticed things he hadn't seen the day before. The boy's ribs were visible through his thin shirt. His feet were covered in small cuts. His shorts were held up by a piece of rope instead of a belt. This wasn't a child playing pretend poverty. This was real. After 20 minutes, Laurent stood and stepped into view. The boy froze mid-dance. His eyes widened, and for a split second, Laurent saw fear flash across his face. The kind of fear that comes from expecting punishment. Daddy, no. Celeste's voice rang out, sharp and desperate. Please don't send him away. Please. Laurent raised a hand gently. I'm not sending anyone away. He looked at the boy. What's your name? The boy swallowed. Nico, monsieur. Nico, Laurent repeated. He stepped closer, studying the boy's face. There was no arrogance there. No deceit. Just caution and something else, dignity. Why did you come into my garden yesterday? Nico's eyes flicked to Celeste, then back to Laurent. I saw her through the fence. She looked sad. I know what that feels like, monsieur. I thought maybe if I danced, she might smile. I didn't come to take anything. I just wanted to give something. Something small. The simplicity of the answer hit Laurent like a punch to the chest. I just wanted to give something. Where do you live, Nico? Laurent asked, his voice softer now. Nico shifted his weight. Anywhere, monsieur. Sometimes under the Pont Lafayette. Sometimes in alleys if they're quiet. I dance at traffic lights for money. Sometimes people give me coins. Sometimes they don't. Celeste gasped softly. You don't have a home? Nico shook his head. Not anymore. Laurent felt something crack inside him. He glanced at his daughter, who was staring at Nico with wide, glistening eyes. Then he looked back at the boy. You can stay. Today. In the garden where I can see you. No tricks. Understood. Nico's face flooded with relief. Yes, monsieur. I understand. Good, Laurent said. Then, almost as an afterthought, he added, and before you leave tonight, the cook will give you a meal. Nico's eyes went wide. Thank you, monsieur. Thank you. Laurent nodded and returned to his bench. But inside, his mind was spinning. 1 day turned into 3. 3 turned into a week. Every afternoon at 4 o'clock, Nico arrived. The guards had been instructed to let him pass. Laurent watched every session from a distance, and what he saw shook him to his core. Celeste was changing. Her hands, once limp, now moved with purpose. She clapped, she gestured. She even tried to copy Nico's movements with her arms. Her voice grew stronger. She gave commands. Do the one where you pretend to be a rooster. Or no, do it like yesterday. And then, one afternoon, something extraordinary happened. Nico was in the middle of his slow-motion dance, moving as if the air around him had turned to honey. Celeste laughed so hard she forgot to hold her blanket. Then, suddenly, she gripped the armrests of her wheelchair. Wait, she said, her voice serious. I want to try something. Nico stopped. Try what? Standing, Celeste said. Laurent, who had been sitting nearby, shot to his feet. Celeste, I don't think. I can do it, Daddy, she said, her jaw set with determination. She placed both hands firmly on the armrests. Her arms trembled. Her face scrunched with effort. Laurent's heart hammered in his chest. Please, God. Please. Slowly, so slowly it felt like time had stopped, Celeste's shoulders lifted. Then her chest. Then, inch by inch, her hips rose from the chair. Her legs shook violently, but they held. She was standing. Nico's mouth fell open. Celeste. 1. Laurent whispered, stepping forward. She sank back into the chair, panting and trembling. For a moment, no one moved. No one spoke. The garden was so quiet Laurent could hear his own heartbeat. Then Nico exploded. You did it. You stood. Celeste, you stood. He spun in wild circles, shouting at the sky. Celeste started laughing, crying and laughing at the same time. Laurent dropped to his knees beside her, his hands shaking as he touched her face. You're so brave, he whispered, his voice breaking. I'm so proud of you. Celeste reached for both of them. One small hand for her father, one for her friend. I'm not scared anymore, she said softly. When Nico dances, I feel like I can do anything. Laurent looked at the boy, this barefoot, homeless boy who had nothing, and felt tears sting his eyes. All his wealth, all his power, all his connections and expensive treatments. None of it had done what this boy had done with nothing but kindness. That night, Laurent couldn't sleep. He walked the long hallways of his mansion, his footsteps echoing against the marble floors. He thought about his pride, his reputation, his carefully constructed image as a powerful, untouchable man. And then he thought about his daughter's laughter, her courage, her joy. By the time dawn broke over the hills of Lyon, Laurent Beaumont had made a decision that would change everything. The following evening, after Celeste had gone to bed, Laurent found Nico sitting alone on the stone steps near the garden gate. The boy's arms were wrapped around his knees, his eyes fixed on the darkening sky, as if trying to memorize the colors before night swallowed them whole. Laurent approached quietly and sat down beside him. Nico flinched slightly, surprised, but didn't move away. You shouldn't be out here alone in the dark, Laurent said gently. Nico shrugged. I'm used to it, monsieur. The dark isn't so bad once you know it. Laurent's chest tightened. He turned to face the boy fully. Not anymore, Nico. From tonight, this is your home. You'll have a bed, 3 meals a day. You'll go to school. And you'll never again have to wonder where you'll sleep or if you'll eat. Nico's eyes went wide. His lips parted, but no words came out. Finally, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, You mean it? I mean it, Laurent said firmly. Listen to me, Nico. I know what you've given my daughter. You gave her something no money, no doctor, no treatment in the world could provide. You gave her hope. And anyone who gives hope, who brings light into darkness, is not just worth knowing. They are worth loving. A tear slid down Nico's cheek. Then another. He tried to wipe them away quickly, embarrassed, but Laurent reached out and gently placed a hand on his shoulder. You don't have to hide your tears here, Laurent said softly. Not anymore. Nico's face crumpled, and for the first time in years, he let himself cry. Not from hunger or fear, but from relief. From feeling, at last, that he mattered. That night, Nico lay in a soft bed in one of the mansion's guest rooms. The sheets smelled like lavender. The pillow cradled his head like a cloud. Outside, the crickets sang, and through the window, he could see the lights of Lyon twinkling in the distance. He closed his eyes and whispered to the darkness, Thank you. For the first time in his life, he felt safe. By the end of the week, the story had spread across Lyon like wildfire. Billionaire Laurent Beaumont adopts street child. The newspapers couldn't get enough of it. Some praised Laurent as a hero. Others called him reckless, naive, even dangerous. At a business luncheon, one of Laurent's oldest partners, a silver-haired man named Gerard, pulled him aside. Laurent, what are you thinking? A street boy in your home? What if he steals? What if he's dangerous? Think of your reputation. Think of your business. Laurent looked at him calmly. My daughter is standing again, Gerard. She's laughing again. She's living again. That is the only reputation I care about. Gerard shook his head. You're a fool, Laurent. Laurent smiled faintly. Perhaps. But I'd rather be a fool with a happy daughter than a wise man with an empty home. Not everyone judged him harshly. Letters began arriving at the mansion. Some from parents whose children also struggled, some from people who had once been homeless themselves. They wrote, Thank you for showing the world that kindness matters more than status. You've given us hope that humanity isn't lost. Your daughter is lucky. And so is that boy. Celeste herself became Nico's fiercest defender. When a distant cousin visited and made a snide remark about the charity case, Celeste wheeled herself right up to her and said firmly, Nico is my brother. If you don't like him, you don't love me. The cousin left early. Weeks turned into months, and the mansion transformed. Mornings began with Celeste calling out, Nico, are you awake yet? Afternoons were filled with laughter as Nico performed new routines or told stories about the streets that made Celeste gasp and giggle. Evenings ended with shared meals around the long dining table, where Laurent found himself smiling more than he had in years. Celeste's therapy improved dramatically. With Nico cheering beside her, she took her first real steps, shaky, uncertain, but real. She still used her wheelchair often, but fear no longer controlled her. She was learning to live again. Laurent, too, began to change. He delegated more at work, spending less time chasing deals and more time at home. He taught Nico how to read financial reports, how to speak confidently, how to carry himself with dignity. And Nico, in turn, taught Laurent something far more valuable. That joy doesn't come from what you own, but from who you love. One quiet evening, as the three of them sat in the garden watching fireflies dance in the twilight, Celeste turned to Nico and said softly, You know what? I'm not alone anymore. I have a brother. Nico's eyes glistened. And I have a sister. Laurent reached out and pulled them both close. For the first time since Isabelle's death, he felt whole. But there was one more piece of the story Nico had never shared. It came out one rainy afternoon when Laurent found Nico staring out the window, his expression distant. Laurent sat beside him. What are you thinking about? Laurent asked gently. Then in a quiet voice he said, I had a sister once. Her name was Elodie. She was younger than me. She got sick when I was 8. We didn't have money for doctors. She died in my arms. Laurent's breath caught. After that, Nico continued, his voice trembling, I couldn't stop moving. If I stayed still, I saw her face. So I danced. I danced to keep her memory alive. I danced so the sadness wouldn't win. He turned to Laurent, tears streaming down his face. When I saw Celeste sitting in that wheelchair, looking so sad, I saw Elodie. I thought maybe this time I can help. Maybe this time I can save someone. Laurent pulled the boy into his arms, holding him tightly as Nico sobbed. You did, Nico, Laurent whispered. You saved her. And you saved me too. A year later, the Beaumont estate looked much the same from the outside. The iron gates still stood tall. The gardens were still immaculate. But inside, everything had changed. Celeste could walk now. Not perfectly, but confidently. She and Nico raced through the halls, laughing and shouting, filling every corner with life. Laurent had funded a foundation to help homeless children across France, inspired by Nico's story. He partnered with shelters, schools, and hospitals, ensuring that no child would have to sleep under a bridge or dance for coins just to survive. And Nico, he still danced. But now, he danced not to escape sadness, but to celebrate joy. One golden afternoon, as the three of them sat together in the garden, Laurent looked at Nico and Celeste and realized something profound. He had spent his entire life chasing wealth, building empires, closing deals, accumulating power. But true wealth had been waiting all along in the form of a barefoot boy with nothing but a kind heart. "I thought I had everything," Laurent whispered to himself. "But I had nothing until I met you." Celeste leaned against her father's shoulder. Nico rested his head on the other side. And as the sun set over the hills of Lyon, painting the sky in gold and crimson, the three of them sat in peaceful silence. Not the heavy silence of grief, but the sacred silence of love. If this story moved you, let me know in the comments. Tell me, where in the world are you watching from? What touched your heart the most? And don't forget to subscribe for more stories that remind us kindness is the truest form of wealth. Until next time, stay kind, stay hopeful, and never underestimate the power of one small act of love. Thank you for listening. God bless you.